What life looked like inside a 1950s British home. Step through the front door of a 1950s British home, and you'll find yourself in a world that feels both familiar and distant. The war years had passed, rationing was ending, and a nation long starved of comfort was beginning to dream again. These houses were modest, yet full of character, blending old traditions with the first glimmers of modern convenience. From patterned wallpaper to coal fires, from hand-cranked mangles to the wonder of the television set, every corner told a story of resilience and quiet optimism. Let's explore what life inside a 1950s British home was really like. The living room, a hearth for family life. In 1950s Britain, the living room was the heart of the home. Known by some as the parlor or front room, it was where families gathered, guests were entertained, and milestones were celebrated. The design choices spoke volumes about post-war tastes. Bold wallpaper, heavy curtains, and thick rugs made the space feel warm against Britain's chilly winters. The fireplace was the centerpiece, a tiled structure that not only heated the room, but also anchored family life. Coal fires produced a smoky comfort, with the mantelpiece proudly displaying wedding photos, keepsakes, and perhaps a clock that ticked steadily. Entertainment revolved around the wireless in the early years of the decade. Radios brought the BBC Home Service, comedy shows, dance music, and drama into homes. By the mid-1950s, however, televisions began to steal the limelight. These large wooden sets with tiny black and white screens quickly became status symbols. The Queen's coronation in 1953 was a turning point, boosting TV sales dramatically as families crowded into living rooms, sometimes even borrowing a neighbor's set to witness the grand event. By 1959, Britain had more than 10 million TV licenses, turning television from novelty into necessity. The furniture that surrounded these sets was solid. Three-piece suites in muted tones like green or brown, draped with lace antimacassars to protect from wear. Floors carried patterned carpets or linoleum beneath, and shelves displayed ornaments that reflected both tradition and aspiration. To step into such a room today would be to step back into the pulse of life in 1950s Britain. The kitchen, practicality over luxury. A 1950s British kitchen was small, efficient, and practical. This was not yet the era of glossy open-plan layouts, but rather one of making the most of tight spaces. Many kitchens were painted in cheerful pastel shades, cream, mint green, or pale yellow, giving a sense of freshness and optimism. The stove was the center of activity. Gas cookers were becoming common, while some families still used black cast-iron ranges. Electric kettles and toasters appeared in advertisements, but they remained luxuries for many. Instead, kettles boiled on the hob, while bread browned under a grill. The sink was usually enamel, sometimes with only cold running water, until later in the decade when hot taps spread. Storage came in the form of built-in cupboards or a freestanding dresser. The pantry or larder was crucial, keeping foods cool before refrigerators became widespread. By 1959, only about 13% of British households owned a fridge, meaning meat safes or marble slabs were still relied upon. Washing clothes was laborious. Most homes had a mangle, a hand-cranked wringer for pressing water from laundry. Twin-tub washing machines were only just making their debut, meaning wash day was still an all-day affair. Women, who carried much of the domestic burden, often spent Mondays doing laundry, pegging lines of wet sheets in the back garden to flap in the wind. The kitchen, while plain compared to modern standards, was truly the workhorse of the house. Its modest appliances and practical layout spoke volumes about how people lived, cooked, and cleaned in 1950s British homes. The dining room, tradition on the wane. Though many families were moving toward informal eating, the dining room still held symbolic value in the 1950s British home. In semi-detached houses, this space often contained a polished mahogany table, wooden chairs, and a sideboard stocked with best crockery and silverware. Family meals were ritualized. A Sunday roast beef or lamb with vegetables, was the highlight of the week, even when meat was still rationed in the early years of the decade. Daily meals were simpler: shepherd's pie, bubble and squeak, toad in the hole, or bread and dripping. Dessert often came in the form of rice pudding, semolina, or home-baked jam tarts. The dining room also doubled as a space for Christmas dinners, birthday teas, or visiting relatives. Though less frequently used than the kitchen table, it represented formality, respectability, and the lingering traditions of pre-war Britain. By the late 1950s, TV suppers were beginning to appear, families balancing trays on their knees in front of the television. But this was still more of an emerging trend than a universal habit. Bedrooms, modesty and shared spaces. Bedrooms in the 1950s. British homes were simple, modest, and functional. Space was tight, and children often shared. Iron bedsteads or bunks were common for youngsters, while parents' rooms featured heavier wooden frames. Furniture was usually part of a matching set: a wardrobe, chest of drawers, and dressing table, often veneered in dark wood. These were not sleek or minimal, but practical and long-lasting. The bed was layered with woolen blankets, eiderdowns, or candlewick bedspreads, with hot water bottles tucked under sheets in winter. Central heating had not yet arrived for most households. Wallpaper was favored over paint, with floral or striped designs creating a cozy atmosphere. Floors were either linoleum or bare boards softened by small rugs. Children treasured toys like teddy bears, dolls, or dinky cars displayed proudly beside the bed. Adults might keep a small wireless or alarm clock at the bedside. Though modest, these bedrooms offered warmth, rest, and stability in a decade when Britain was slowly rebuilding itself. The bathroom, progress creeping in. The bathroom told the story of Britain's slow march toward modernization. Many pre-war houses had only outdoor toilets and tin baths by the fire, but by the 1950s, indoor bathrooms were becoming the norm. A typical bathroom featured a cast-iron tub, enameled white, sometimes standing on claw feet. Showers were almost unheard of. Families often bathed weekly, with children sharing the same water to save time and fuel. Towels were thin by today's standards, and the room was usually unheated, making winter baths a chilly business. Toilets were often in a separate room, sometimes attached to the back of the house. Linoleum was the standard flooring, chosen for its durability and easy cleaning. By the late 1950s, pastel-colored bathroom suites, pink, green, or powder blue, began to appear, signaling a new desire for style as well as function. The bathroom symbolized progress. It was plain and practical, but for families used to outdoor privies and tin baths, it felt like a step into modern living. Household gadgets, the first wave of convenience. One of the most exciting parts of life in 1950s. Britain was the arrival of labor-saving devices. Advertisements promised that new gadgets would transform daily life, even if only a minority could afford them straight away. The vacuum cleaner became more common, with models like the Hoover Jr. finding their way into homes. Electric irons, easier than flat irons heated on the stove, were widely adopted. Refrigerators were still a rarity in the early decade, but gained popularity as prices fell. Washing machines, initially twin-tub designs, arrived in middle-class homes. By the end of the 1950s, these machines were beginning to revolutionize domestic chores. But nothing matched the allure of television. By 1959, over 10 million TV licenses had been issued, transforming entertainment. Programs like The Grove Family, 6-5 Special, and coverage of major events created shared national experiences. These gadgets didn't just change convenience, they reshaped the rhythm of 1950s lifestyle in Britain, ushering in a consumer era that set the stage for the swinging 1960s. The garden, self-sufficiency and beauty. Post-war Britain encouraged homegrown produce, and the habit lingered in the 1950s. Gardens were spaces of utility and pride. Many families grew potatoes, carrots, beans, and cabbages. Fruit bushes, apple trees, and rhubarb patches were common sights. Chicken coops sometimes dotted suburban gardens, continuing the wartime dig-for-victory spirit. Preserving food, bottling fruit, making jams, or pickling vegetables was an annual tradition. Yet gardens were also for beauty. Lawns were carefully trimmed, roses and chrysanthemums planted in neat borders, and garden gnomes began their rise in popularity. The garden was both productive and ornamental, reflecting the balance between tradition and leisure in 1950s Britain. The sounds and smells of home, memory made tangible. Perhaps what lingers most in the memory of a 1950s British home is its sensory atmosphere. The crackle of a coal fire, the rich smell of stewing cabbage or baking bread, the tang of carbolic soap in the bathroom. Music drifted from gramophones or radios, playing crooners like Vera Lynn, still beloved in the early 50s, Alma Cogan in the middle of the decade, or the emerging rock and roll of Cliff Richard by the decade's end. Children's laughter echoed in shared bedrooms, while the tick-tock of the mantel clock set the pace of daily life. Even the textures mattered. The scratch of woolen blankets, the smoothness of Bakelite telephones, the cold lino underfoot in winter mornings. These details made the 1950s house more than bricks and mortar. It was a living, breathing stage for everyday British life. Inside a 1950s British home, you find a blend of tradition and change, austerity and hope. These houses were modest, practical, and sometimes austere, yet they carried the optimism of a nation on the move. They were homes of coal fires, patterned wallpaper, and emerging modern gadgets, rich with warmth and resilience. They tell us not just where Britain lived, but how it dreamed. Thank you for watching this video. Please don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell.